All right, welcome everybody to Lecture 5 in the MISU Drought Seminar series that we're doing. I'm Professor Toby Alt from the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Science at Cornell University, and I am a visiting Fulbright Scholar this year at Stockholm University. So today we're going to talk about one of the thorniest and also probably most exciting areas of drought research, which is trying to observe and monitor soil moisture across space and through time. So far, we've largely avoided the problem of directly monitoring it by using indices and models of varying complexity. But today we're going to get into a few of the recent developments that have made widespread and somewhat long-term, at least interannual timescales of soil moisture measurements available. And want to go through both the remote sensing developments that have happened in the last 10 years or so and some of the data sets associated with them, as well as in situ measurements, which are becoming increasingly easy to make and collate and use using low-cost sensors. All right, so remote sensing, primarily we're going to talk about satellite remote sensing today, and in situ measurements. Here's a picture of the NASA SMAP satellite, which we'll talk about in a second here, before it went into space to measure soil moisture remotely. And SMAP stands for Soil Moisture Active Passive Mission. So active passive means that it's going to be both passively observing some sort of signals from the Earth's surface, as well as active, meaning it's going to be trying to amplify those signals by boosting them with its own source of energy. So the SMAP mission, this is the schematic diagram that you'll find in the user's manual. There's an arm on the satellite itself that swivels around and beams down, I guess, sort of an electromagnetic beam that's between the microwave and radio wave frequencies. It's called the L band. I'll get into that in just a second. It swivels around, beaming down and also absorbing what's coming off the Earth, this electromagnetic signal to be able to detect soil moisture. And it's on a polar orbit, and so it passes by the same place every few days, which gives you global coverage at very high spatial resolution. We're talking, some of the products would be even higher than 9 kilometers, but at least 9 kilometer spatial resolution, and for multiple years. Because the band that it's using, this L band, it can see, quote unquote, see right through the clouds. So let's talk a little bit about how that actually works. We're going to go back to black body radiation, which hopefully you're somewhat familiar with, but just a quick refresher if it's a little rusty to you. Black body radiation says that the electromagnetic radiation flux in units of watts per meter squared, so you can think of this as like light, but it's not only light, it's the whole spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, is equal to the Stefan-Boltzmann constant, it's just a number there, sigma, multiplied by temperature raised to the 4th power. And we're gonna appeal to that principle, but we also need to take it a step further and consider the Planck function from which blackbody radiation is derived. So the Planck function predicts the amplitude of different spectral energies. So think of this as like the brightness of different wavelengths of light across the electromagnetic spectrum. And because we're looking at the whole electromagnetic spectrum, we're not only thinking about light, we're thinking about radio waves, microwaves, gamma waves, you name it. The whole continuum of electromagnetic radiation is used in this Planck function so that the wavelength there, the frequency wavelength, is used as one of the independent variables. And from that, pick a given temperature as the other independent variable, and you have a prediction of spectral energy density at any given frequency at any given temperature. And so that's what these curves are. These are Earth-like temperatures, from 200K to 350K. A little bit cooler and a little bit warmer, but certainly encompassing that range. Now, this is important to remember because what it's emphasizing and what I want you to focus on is that any object that has any temperature is emitting electromagnetic radiation across a range of frequencies. And that includes the Earth being an object that emits electromagnetic radiation across a range of frequencies. And we're going to hone in on one of those frequencies. because we're focusing, as I mentioned before, on this L band, and what's attached to the SMAP satellite is an L-band radiometer. Well, what does that mean? It means that it's able to detect electromagnetic radiation in the 1 to 2 gigahertz scale. So where does that fall on this whole continuum of electromagnetic radiation? I'll let you do the mental exercise and then I'll show you in the next slide. So here's the whole continuum of electromagnetic radiation, from radio waves being the lowest frequency, longest wavelengths on the left, all the way out to gamma rays being the highest frequency on the right, and everything in between. So 1 to 2 gigahertz, that's going to be, a gigahertz is 10 to the ninth, and that's right there in that transition zone from microwave to radio wave. That's what's being used to detect surface soil moisture. So if you think about it like this, just conceptually now, taking a step back. All right, here's a picture of a forest in central California. It happens to be a redwood forest, and I'm looking down at it just with my camera. These trees are full, or at least have some moisture in them. They are taking moisture out of the soil and up into the canopy. And so if you could strip away everything except for the moisture in those trees, if you could only see the liquid water in those trees, conceptually, maybe it looks something like this, right? Now you're imagining you've just filtered out everything except for the liquid moisture. Now trees actually end up in the satellite remote sensing of surface soil moisture. Trees are interference. They are noise. They're actually blocking our view of the surface layer of soil moisture. Because what we actually care about and what the SMAP mission is designed to capture is that top 5 centimeters of surface soil water, liquid water or frozen water in the soils. And the trees are getting in the way. But I'm putting this out there because I want you to start really conceptually thinking about what would the world look like if we could just only see the liquid water and the solid water as we go around. Here's another example. Okay, this is a picture I took out of my airplane window landing in upstate New York, landing in Syracuse a few years ago. And again, mental exercise. What if we could just only see the liquid water? Well, obviously the lakes should pop out, and it's springtime, so we expect that maybe those farms that are pictured here would also be would have a high amount of liquid water in them. And I can tell you that they do this time of year. I was out in the field this time of year. This was the spring, I think, of 2018, and it was pretty moist. It was pretty wet and soggy. And if we could just see that, if we could just see that liquid water, it might look something like this, right? And that's what the L band is able to see, quote unquote. And just like I mentioned before, the trees act kind of like interference, like they're maybe blocking our view of the surface layer. But that's ultimately what this satellite remote sensing product is trying to do, and what it's capturing is the surface water, about 5 centimeters from space, through time, all over the globe, which makes it a really unique and amazing product. And not only that, it's able to determine whether it's liquid or solid water. And it all hinges on being able to view the electromagnetic spectrum in this narrow 1 to 2 gigahertz band. Here's an example from the NASA web pages of frost, frozen soils melting in spring. So just going from April 1st to April 13th, 2-week period. You can see across much of the northern hemisphere, go from frozen soils to soils that have thawed out. It's going from blue to red. Here's another example of SMAP soil moisture being used to look at flooding. This is a period of flooding, severe flooding in the southeastern United States. And you can see in those blue areas, those are locations where the soils are already saturated, basically saturated. So any additional water is just going to go into runoff, as you might remember from your leaky bucket models. So in almost real time, and certainly within a few days, you can get a lot of information across a large scale that then can be fed into a catchment model or flood planning risk assessment models using this type of data. Another satellite remote sensing mission that has been important in our understanding of drought and terrestrial hydroclimate in the last decade is the GRACE mission, which is actually measuring gravity with 2 satellites right close to each other. And as they orbit the Earth, they have very high precision sensor of their position relative to each other. And when one of them goes over a gravitational anomaly, i.e., when one of them goes over an area that has slightly more mass than the other one, it dips down closer to the surface of the Earth, and that measurement gets logged and recorded and used to infer the gravitational effects on this pair of satellites. And that in turn can be used to infer moisture content in the upper, few meters, even maybe tens of meters of the Earth's crust. All other things, once you've ruled out all other things, it can obviously detect more than just soil moisture. It's not the primary, or it's not the only purpose of this mission. But in the case of the California drought recently, you're able to see big depletions in aquifers, as well as other aquifers all over the world, which are being depleted at a higher rate than they're being recharged. This GRACE satellite mission was able to pick up places where the mass of water underneath the Earth's surface was disappearing, and in many cases at a pretty alarming rate. All right, let's talk about in situ measurements real quickly here. Shifting gears entirely. This first bullet point is important to think about because this is the only real way to measure soil moisture directly. Just think about it for a second. We measure temperature, we measure precipitation, we measure other meteorological variables that we care about. Our instruments are designed to basically measure the thing that it is that we're trying to monitor. When it comes to soil moisture, we can't really do that in the same way, because to truly measure soil moisture, you have to go in, take a sample, weigh it, dry it out, weigh it again. That's what's going to tell you how much soil moisture is present. Well, in so doing, you have just destroyed the sample that you were interested in. You can no longer do a real-time measurement of soil moisture content. So you have to come up with other methods of indirectly measuring soil moisture. All techniques, in principle, when you're using other methods, should be calibrated against this one. You can read about this in the papers for today. There are neutron probes, which detect collisions with hydrogen atoms inside a core. Again, it's somewhat destructive. It's very expensive. It's more expensive than some of the other techniques. Labor intensive, and it requires you to work with radioactive material to detect the collisions between the hydrogen atoms and the probe itself. There are a handful of electromagnetic techniques, which are probably the most common, widely used ones that you'd be familiar with. The basic idea is that water conducts electricity pretty well, right? So if you can run an electrical current through a segment of soil, that should, in principle, tell you about how much water is there. If it's all water, it should conduct pretty well, and if it's just dry earth, it probably should not conduct very well. What we end up measuring ultimately is usually the capacitance of the soils themselves, and as that capacitance varies through time, you end up with a proxy measurement for soil moisture content. There's other techniques that I don't know a lot about, but I wanted to put them out there. You're welcome to do your own Googling around for them. There's cosmic ray techniques that have been pointed to in the literature as potentially very promising ways of doing real-time in situ measurements, as well as tensometers, which are indirect vegetation-based techniques that allow you to simultaneously capture vegetation state or moisture stress in a plant or in a tree or in some crop, and soil moisture. And one example of this, not from direct measurements, but from remote sensing, I'll get into in a second. Just we talk about an experiment that we're running in upstate New York. This is data from my vacation in August 4th, 2020. I was in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State, and we arrived there at about the same time this hurricane Isaias arrived to where we were. And so didn't have much to do, was cooped up inside all day while the hurricane rain bands passed overhead. And I was watching, on this vacation, our soil moisture sensors, which are out in the field in the Cayuga Nature Center, through time. And I guess just like you'd expect, boy, the moisture, right as those rain bands passed overhead, shoots up and then started to decline. And if you look carefully as it declines, after this initial pulse of water, you see there's another little peak and another little peak and another little peak. But those are not new rainfall events. That's actually nighttime. That's when the trees are not doing evapotranspiration. They're doing respiration instead. It's dark, so they're not doing photosynthesis. And because it's dark and they're not doing photosynthesis, they relax, in a sense, they relax the column of water that they hold that attaches their roots. The column of water that normally runs from all the way from the root zone to the leaves relaxes a little bit, and that means more soil moisture accumulates in the surface layer that we're measuring right here. There's something weird happening on the right one. It looks like there's some noise around Tuesday, August 11th. There's a weird drop in the variance. And then those other peaks on this diagram are the effects of another rainstorm a few days later. It's actually the same system as it's falling apart, sort of moves around, bounces around the northeast, and then another big rainstorm. That's just an in situ measurement example of the electromagnetic technique. This is from sensors that we've deployed in the field. There's also this project that you can familiarize yourselves with. It's an international data bank of soil moisture measurements, some of them in real time, close to real time, getting you all the way up through present. This is just a snapshot of what you look at, what you'd see if you went to this page right now. And soil moisture in any one location might not be that indicative of what's happening at a larger spatial scale. We've talked about this before. Basically, the problems with soil moisture and its ability to represent larger scale conditions are in part related to the fact that precipitation tends to be pretty heterogeneous. Now, in the springtime, in boreal regions, like the one that's shown here, the winter storms that tend to deliver most of the moisture have large spatial scales. So right now, if you look at this map just sort of, loosely, quickly, you can see there do seem to be areas where things are consistently dry or wet. But grain of salt, if you're going to use data like this, be aware that the site that you're looking at might not necessarily be representative of what's happening at the larger spatial scale. Here I've zoomed into one of the sites in the northeast. This is from Hubbard Brook, which is a famous long-term observational site, and you can see there's that strong asymptotic behavior that's characteristic, really typical of soil moisture, where it rains, it gets very saturated very quickly, and then it has sort of it's almost like an exponential decay as soil moisture decreases and then gets recharged again by the next rainfall event. So on short time scales, soil moisture is not very normally distributed, and you'll see that once you start to look at the data and play around with the data. All right, I had said I would talk about indirect measurements for soil moisture, and here's a quick example of how that might work just from a remote sensing perspective, where if you imagine that you are using something like NDVI, which if you're not familiar with it, it's a very general metric of relative greenness taken from space, from satellites. If you're looking at vegetation that's pretty happy, plenty of moisture, it's going to be pretty green. As it starts to dry out, the NDVI will change, and at some point it will wilt and die, and then potentially, if it rains again, regrow. Now, some authors have tried and successfully used the relationship between NDVI and soil moisture to infer soil moisture at the same time that they are inferring moisture stress in plants. So this has been done with remote sensing. It's also being done experimentally, as far as I know, from a handful of institutions around the world with sensors that are actually directly tied into the vegetation itself. It's very much, and I'm emphasizing this because it's an active, exciting area of research and inquiry that's relatively new and holds a lot of promise, because ultimately when we talk about drought, we care about soil moisture because we care about the effects of soil moisture on plants and plant stress. Being able to get two of these for the price of one, being able to measure plant stress, water stress at the same time that we measure soil moisture would be a really novel and important development. All right, that's all I got. I will add the recommended reading, the further reading to this later. Thank you.